He left her on their wedding day for another woman. 5 years later, he saw her with a daughter who looked exactly like him. The garden was in full bloom, bathed in warm sunlight and lined with white roses, lanterns, and guests dressed in soft pastels. Hazel Rivers stood at the altar, her hands clasped tightly around her bouquet, trying to calm the trembling that ran through her body. It wasn't nerves from doubt. She loved Nicholas Bennett more than she had ever loved anyone. It was the overwhelming reality of standing on the edge of the life they had dreamed of together, a life she had imagined for so long it felt almost surreal that it was finally here. The whispers of anticipation around her faded into a blur as she focused on the path ahead, waiting for him to appear. But the minutes passed, and Nicholas did not come. At first she thought perhaps something had delayed him: traffic, a call, a last-minute emergency. But when her maid of honor leaned in and whispered something that made her stomach drop, Hazel knew something was terribly wrong. Nicholas wasn't just late. He wasn't coming. The words didn't register at first. Her brain refused to process them, as if her heart had blocked the message to protect her. But then came the ripple through the guests, the confused glances, the murmurs, the uncomfortable silence. And finally confirmation from someone close to Nicholas's inner circle. He had left with Cassandra Whitmore, his ex-girlfriend, and they were seen driving off minutes before the ceremony. Hazel didn't cry. Not yet. She stood motionless for a long time, as though frozen by the blow that had just shattered everything around her. The guests began to shift, some already leaving, others offering forced words of comfort. Her mother tried to speak to her, but Hazel stepped back from everyone, turned, and walked down the aisle alone. No one stopped her. She didn't want to be touched, pitied, or questioned. She walked out of the garden, out of the venue, and straight into a car that took her far away from the spectacle. Inside, she was spiraling, her heart cracked open in slow, aching waves. She kept seeing his face the way he used to look at her when he promised her forever, when he kissed her forehead and told her nothing would ever come between them. She had believed him. She had believed him so much that she hadn't told him she was pregnant, not because she was hiding it, but because she wanted that moment to be perfect, intimate, something they would celebrate together in the quiet after the wedding. But now that moment was gone, replaced by humiliation, betrayal, and an emptiness so sharp it made her physically ill. Alone in the small apartment they had picked out together but never moved into, Hazel stared at the ultrasound photo tucked inside her planner. It was still so early, only a few weeks along. She hadn't told anyone yet, but now, everything was different. The future she had planned was gone, and she would have to start over, pregnant, alone, heartbroken. The realization came slowly but hit her with brutal clarity. Nicholas had chosen someone else, not just over a relationship but over the family they had unknowingly already begun. Hazel sat there until the sun went down, the weight of the day settling over her like a blanket she couldn't pull off. She knew she couldn't stay, not in this city, not in this life that had betrayed her. So that night, while the media speculated and her name trended in gossip articles for being the jilted bride, Hazel packed a small bag, gathered what little money she had, and quietly disappeared. No explanations, no revenge, no contact, just silence. Because sometimes the only way to heal is to vanish from the place where you were broken and start again somewhere no one knows your name. Hazel didn't look back as the train pulled out of the city. Her reflection flickered in the glass beside the blur of passing trees and buildings, her face pale and drawn but steady. She had chosen a small coastal town far from the noise, far from the tabloids, and far from the life that had crumbled in a single afternoon. It was a town where no one would recognize her as the runaway bride, where she wouldn't be pitied or whispered about. It wasn't glamorous or full of opportunity, but it was quiet, and that was all she needed. She arrived with only 2 suitcases and a single goal: survive for herself and the life growing quietly inside her. The first few weeks were brutal. She stayed in a run-down motel until she could find a studio apartment that didn't ask too many questions. Her savings, once carefully built with Nicholas's encouragement, had been tied up in joint accounts she no longer had access to. She worked odd jobs helping in a florist shop, cleaning holiday rentals, folding clothes in a tiny laundromat. No one knew she had once dined in penthouses or worn custom-made dresses. No one knew she cried herself to sleep every night, clutching her stomach and whispering promises to the baby she hadn't even met yet. Eventually, she landed a part-time job at the town's only bookstore, a cozy little place owned by an elderly woman named Margaret who had no interest in who Hazel used to be. Margaret gave her the kind of acceptance she hadn't known. She needed quiet, kind, and without judgment. For the first time in weeks, Hazel began to breathe again. The scent of old books, the hum of quiet music, the soft chatter of regular customers, it all helped stitch the pieces of her back together. As the months passed, her belly grew, and so did her resolve. She began to prepare for motherhood with the same quiet determination she once poured into wedding plans. She read every parenting book she could find, attended free clinics, and took long walks along the shore when the nausea or loneliness became too much. The baby kicked for the first time in the middle of a thunderstorm. Hazel had sat on the windowsill listening to the rain and crying quietly when she felt the tiniest flutter beneath her skin. It felt like a message, "You're not alone, we're in this together." When Sophie was born on a calm spring morning, Hazel held her close and wept harder than she ever had in her life. The little girl had blonde hair, soft and wispy, and startling blue eyes that stared up at her with innocent wonder. There was no denying the resemblance. She looked exactly like her father. But Hazel didn't allow bitterness into the room, not that day. That day was sacred. She named her Sophie because it meant wisdom. And in that fragile moment, nothing felt more true. Motherhood was nothing like she expected. It was harder, messier, and more beautiful than she had ever imagined. She had no family to lean on, no friends from her old life who still knew where she was, but the town began to slowly embrace her. Margaret became like a quiet grandmother figure, offering free books and extra tea bags. The woman who ran the daycare helped watch Sophie when Hazel had long shifts. And the barista from the cafe next door always made her coffee just the way she liked it, without asking how she was holding up. 3 years passed like a slow tide. Hazel still thought about Nicholas sometimes, especially on hard days or when Sophie asked why she didn't have a daddy. But she never spoke his name. She had built a world that didn't include him, one made of bedtime stories, beach picnics, and soft lullabies. Sophie grew into a bright, curious child with her mother's quiet resilience and her father's bold eyes. She didn't know her history, only that her mother loved her more than anything else in the world. Hazel had sworn to herself that she would never let him back in no matter what. He had made his choice, and she had survived without him. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that fate had already begun to stir in the background, drawing a path that would bring their worlds crashing back together in a way she never expected. Nicholas Bennett stood before the wall of floor-to-ceiling glass in his penthouse, overlooking the city he had once ruled with confident ease, now watching it as if through a barrier he no longer understood. 5 years had passed since the wedding day that never happened. 5 years since he had walked away from the only woman who had ever truly known him. The regret wasn't sudden. It had built slowly over time, layer by layer, as his once carefully structured world began to fall apart from the inside out. The marriage to Cassandra had lasted less than 2 years, and every day of it had been a quiet war. She was cunning, beautiful, and destructive in ways he hadn't seen until it was far too late. Their relationship, born from vanity and pressure, had crumbled into bitterness and betrayal. When the divorce papers were signed, there hadn't even been a fight, just silence, as if neither of them had anything left worth saying. But even after she left, Nicholas didn't find peace. The penthouse remained cold no matter how high the heating, the parties felt empty, and the success that once made him feel invincible now felt like an anchor around his neck. His father, who had once insisted on the marriage to Cassandra to secure alliances and expand their company's influence, now barely spoke to him except in board meetings. And as the business grew, Nicholas began to shrink inside, his identity dissolving in the corridors of corporate obligation. He tried to distract himself. He traveled, bought properties, even dated again, though none of the relationships lasted more than a few weeks. There was always a missing piece, a quiet voice reminding him of what he'd walked away from, not just the woman, but the chance to build something real, something lasting. He had replayed that day in his mind so many times, her face at the altar, the confusion, the hurt, how she hadn't screamed or chased after him, how she had simply disappeared. He had told himself she was better off, that they weren't meant to be. But with every passing year that lie grew harder to hold. One night, alone in his office, Nicholas found himself searching her name. There were no photos, no recent updates, no social media, nothing. It was as if she had vanished completely. He even hired a private investigator once but canceled the contract halfway through, feeling it would be a betrayal of her silence. He told himself that if she wanted to be found, she would have left a trail, but still, her absence gnawed at him. It wasn't just guilt, it was the sense that he had walked away from the one chance he'd ever had at real happiness. And worse, he didn't know what he had destroyed. He thought back to how she had looked at him in the final weeks before the wedding. There had been something in her eyes, something she hadn't said out loud. He had been too consumed by corporate politics and family pressure to notice it then, but now, it haunted him. What had he missed? Nicholas began to withdraw from the spotlight. He reduced his hours, declined major appearances, turned down interviews and public engagements. He spent more time reading, walking through the quieter parts of the city, and sitting in cafes alone, watching strangers with their families. He had everything he once thought mattered: wealth, status, power, and yet, he had never felt more hollow. On the 5th anniversary of what should have been his wedding day, he took a flight to clear his head. No destination in mind, just the need to move to escape the airlessness of his life. At the airport, dressed casually in jeans and a dark sweater, with no assistants, no press, no entourage, he felt more like himself than he had in years. He stopped at a coffee kiosk near his gate. While waiting for his drink, something caught his eye, a flash of movement, a familiar curve of a face in the crowd. He turned almost instinctively and saw her. Hazel. She hadn't changed much, though her features were more defined, her hair longer, her posture stronger. She held the hand of a small child, a girl no older than 5 with soft blonde curls and bright blue eyes that struck Nicholas like lightning. He couldn't breathe. The world didn't spin or slow down, it simply froze. That face, those eyes, that child. His child. He knew it without question. And that moment every missed call, every regret, every dream he had tried to bury came crashing back. And before he could decide what to do, Hazel looked up and saw him. Hazel's heart skipped a beat the moment her eyes met his. Time, which had stretched and healed and reshaped her life over the last 5 years, suddenly collapsed into that single second of recognition. Nicholas stood only a few meters away, frozen mid-step, holding a coffee cup that he didn't seem to realize was tipping slightly in his hand. His gaze wasn't on her, it was on Sophie. Hazel instinctively reached down, gently guiding her daughter closer, as if to shield her from a memory that had just come alive. Sophie, oblivious to the tension crackling in the air, tugged on Hazel's hand and pointed at a stuffed animal display, asking softly if they could go look. Hazel nodded, her voice catching in her throat, and they turned as if walking away could undo the collision of 2 worlds that were never meant to meet again. But Nicholas didn't move, and Hazel knew he had seen too much. She didn't rush, she didn't run. Instead, she found a quiet bench near a quieter gate and sat with Sophie, her hands trembling slightly as she helped the girl open her snack. Her mind raced. What had just happened? Why was he here? Would he follow? She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the silence of her own imagination. What she would say if they ever crossed paths again, what he would say, how she would stand tall and unshaken. But none of those imagined scenarios prepared her for the way his face looked when he finally approached, stunned, hesitant, but without any of the cold arrogance she remembered. He didn't speak right away. He stood just a few feet away, his voice catching as he finally found the courage to say her name. Hazel. He whispered like the word itself was fragile. She looked up at him with guarded eyes and a stiff nod, but she didn't stand. She didn't want to create a scene, not in front of Sophie, not here. He glanced at the girl beside her, and it was painfully clear he already knew the truth. Sophie looked so much like him it hurt to deny it. Is she? He started to ask, but his voice cracked. Hazel cut him off with a firm look. Yes, she said softly, she's yours. The words hung heavy between them. Sophie looked up at the stranger and blinked curiously. Hi, she said simply, her voice bright and unbothered by the tension her mother couldn't conceal. Nicholas crouched slowly, keeping his distance, unsure whether he was allowed to respond. "Aye," he replied gently, and Hazel noticed how carefully he chose his posture, his tone, like a man approaching something sacred and breakable. Hazel waited. She didn't explain, she didn't apologize, she didn't owe him that. "I didn't know," he said, still kneeling. "I didn't know, Hazel, I swear to you, if I had—" "You made your choice," she said quietly, her voice not angry but weary. "You left, you married someone else. I didn't owe you anything after that." Nicholas lowered his head for a moment, taking it all in, the gravity of what he had missed, what he had lost. "You're right," he said finally. "I don't have an excuse. I never stopped thinking about you. I thought I could move on, and I didn't even try hard enough to find you. That's on me." Hazel felt the walls around her softening, just slightly, not from his words, but from the honesty in them. He looked older. Not in the lines on his face, but in his posture, his humility. The man in front of her was not the man who had walked out of her life years ago in pursuit of ambition and image. Sophie, growing bored of the adult conversation, leaned into Hazel and whispered something about wanting juice. Hazel reached into her bag and handed her a box, then glanced at Nicholas. "We're flying back home tonight. She has school on Monday." "Where's home?" he asked carefully. She hesitated. "A small town. You wouldn't know it." He nodded, understanding that she wasn't ready to give him more than that. Can I see you again?" he asked, and his voice was so quiet she almost missed it. Hazel looked at him for a long moment. She wasn't ready, she didn't trust him. But Sophie had smiled at him, and something in her chest ached at the idea of denying her daughter the truth she had kept buried. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "This wasn't supposed to happen." "I know," he said, rising slowly, "but I'm glad it did." He didn't ask for contact information, he didn't press. He simply looked at Sophie one more time and whispered, "You're beautiful," before walking away. Hazel sat in silence after he left, heart pounding, not from fear but from the unmistakable feeling that the past had just knocked on the door of the future, and this time it wasn't going to leave quietly. The days following their unexpected airport encounter unfolded with a strange quietness Hazel couldn't shake. Her mind kept replaying the moment she saw Nicholas standing there, the stunned look in his eyes, the tremble in his voice, the way he had knelt in front of Sophie like a man confronting a truth he never imagined. She had returned home, hoping to push it away, to fold it into memory and move on as she always had. But something had shifted. Her world had been so carefully built, brick by brick, shielded by routine, and now it pulsed with uncertainty. Sophie, on the other hand, seemed unaffected. She had spoken briefly about the nice man at the airport, asking if they'd see him again. Hazel had said she didn't know. It wasn't a lie, she truly didn't. A week passed. Then another. And just when Hazel had begun to convince herself that Nicholas would disappear once more, a letter arrived not in the mailbox but by courier. It was handwritten on thick paper, her name spelled out in elegant, unmistakable penmanship. She hesitated before opening it, her fingers tense with hesitation. Inside was not a demand or an apology, but a request. Nicholas had found the name of her bookstore through quiet, respectful channels. Margaret, the owner, had apparently received a generous anonymous donation for children's books the same week, and he asked for a single meeting. Not for drama, not for confrontation, just a conversation. Hazel took 3 days to decide. When she finally agreed, they met in a small, neutral cafe halfway between her town and the city. She arrived early, choosing a corner seat, arms crossed, jaw tight. She expected him to be late or to arrive polished and smug as he once had. Instead, he came quietly, in a simple sweater and jeans, carrying no briefcase, no agenda, just the same worn expression she remembered from the airport. There was an awkward pause as they sat across from each other. The clink of cups, the soft murmur of nearby conversations, the low hum of music filled the space between them. Nicholas was the first to speak. He didn't launch into speeches, he didn't ask for forgiveness. He started with one sentence. "She looks exactly like my sister did when we were little." Hazel didn't reply, but she didn't leave either. That he seemed to take as a small mercy. He told her about the years she had missed, the unraveling of his marriage to Cassandra, the way his father's approval had turned to silence, how his victories in business had grown hollow. He admitted he had thought of Hazel often, not just in regret but in grief. Grief for the life they might have had, for the child he didn't know he had fathered, for the love he had believed he didn't deserve. Hazel listened, not sure if she believed every word but unable to deny how different he seemed. He asked nothing of her, only about Sophie, her favorite color, what made her laugh, whether she liked animals or had any fears. It stunned Hazel how gently he handled each detail, as if they were delicate glass he'd broken once and dared not drop again. For the first time in years she found herself speaking freely, telling stories about their daughter's quirks and talents, her stubbornness, her joy. And when she looked up, she saw tears in Nicholas's eyes, not for show, not manipulation, but something deep and raw that even he hadn't expected. At the end of the meeting, Nicholas stood to leave. He didn't ask to see Sophie, he didn't press her for more. He simply thanked Hazel for her time, said he was proud of her, and promised that whether or not he ever saw them again, he would be better because of that day. That night Hazel couldn't sleep. The words replayed in her mind over and over, not because they were perfect, but because they were quiet and honest and entirely without expectation. She had spent years building walls around herself and Sophie, walls that had kept them safe but also alone. And now, for the first time in a long time, Hazel felt the faintest breeze coming through a crack in those walls. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of something she thought she'd never feel again. Possibility. In the weeks that followed their meeting at the cafe, Hazel found herself caught in a quiet conflict between instinct and memory. She had built a life based on resilience and control, where every decision revolved around Sophie's stability and her own independence. Letting Nicholas back in even at a distance threatened that balance, and yet she couldn't ignore how something within her had shifted. She found herself thinking about that meeting more than she wanted to admit. The way he had asked about Sophie without expectation, the way he hadn't defended his past, the way he had simply listened. He had given her no pressure, no guilt, just a possibility she never thought she'd consider again. Hazel decided to take a step, not a leap, but something small. She sent Nicholas a message through the same courier who had delivered his letter, asking if he would like to meet Sophie in a public park the following weekend. There were conditions: no gifts, no sudden emotional confessions, and no talking to Sophie about the past. Just presence, just the chance to let their daughter decide for herself if she felt safe around him. He responded with a simple, "Thank you, I'll be there," and Hazel tried not to let her anxiety show as the day approached. When Saturday morning arrived, the park was quiet, washed in the soft gold of early autumn. Hazel dressed Sophie in her favorite polka-dot jacket and tied her blonde hair into 2 messy pigtails. She didn't tell her exactly who they were meeting, only that it was a new friend Mommy had known a long time ago. Sophie, ever curious, asked a dozen questions on the walk there, most of which Hazel answered with vague smiles and nervous glances at her watch. Nicholas was already there when they arrived, sitting on a bench near the playground with 2 coffees in hand and a paper bag of muffins beside him. He stood the moment he saw them but didn't rush forward. Instead, he waited as Hazel approached, his eyes never leaving Sophie's face. Hazel gave him a brief nod, motioning toward the swings, and said, "She likes to start there." What followed was not dramatic or filled with tears. It was simple and awkward and strangely peaceful. Nicholas stood nearby as Sophie climbed onto the swing, offering to push her gently. At first she glanced back at Hazel for reassurance, and when Hazel nodded, Sophie allowed it. A few moments passed, and then came laughter, small, sweet, spontaneous laughter as the swing lifted higher and higher. Nicholas didn't speak much, but he smiled in a way Hazel hadn't seen since long before their wedding had fallen apart. It was genuine and quiet, filled with something like awe. They spent over an hour together. Nicholas helped Sophie feed ducks, held her jacket while she ran across the grass, and even let her place a sticker on his shirt from a pack she had brought with her. Hazel watched closely, every instinct on high alert, but she found no reason to pull away. He wasn't trying to impress, he wasn't trying to force a connection, he was simply there, present, and that meant more than any apology ever could. As they prepared to leave, Sophie tugged on Hazel's sleeve and asked if they could come back to the park with Mr. Nick again. Hazel paused, looked at Nicholas and said, "Maybe." Sophie grinned and ran ahead, and for a moment Hazel and Nicholas stood in silence. Then she said, "That went better than I expected." Nicholas looked at her, hopeful but cautious, and replied, "Thank you for trusting me with her, even for a little while." Hazel didn't respond immediately. She was still processing the ease with which their daughter had accepted him, the comfort in her eyes, the way she had looked back to him not as a stranger, but as someone familiar, as if a part of her had recognized what Hazel had spent years hiding. The wall she had spent so long maintaining was no longer a fortress. It was a gate, and for the first time it was open, just a little. They parted without promises, but with something else, understanding. And as Hazel walked home holding Sophie's hand, she realized that this chapter of their lives wasn't something she had planned for. But that didn't mean it couldn't be something good. The next few months unfolded like an unfamiliar melody, quiet at first, cautious in rhythm, but growing steadily more harmonious with each passing week. Nicholas became a gentle presence in Sophie's life, not as a sudden, sweeping force, but like a slow-moving tide that reshaped the shoreline without erasing it. He visited on weekends, often bringing books or simple toys he thought she might enjoy, but always following Hazel's rules. No spoiling, no over-promising, no prying. He understood that his presence in their lives was not a given, it had to be earned. And he didn't try to rush the process. He showed up, consistently, and to Hazel's cautious surprise, that started to matter. Sophie grew increasingly comfortable around him. She began asking when Daddy Nick would come again, and one day she casually asked Hazel why he didn't live with them. The question caught Hazel off guard. She hadn't yet figured out how to explain the complicated history without turning it into a wound. She answered simply, saying that sometimes grown-ups take time to figure out the right way to be a family. Sophie seemed satisfied with that, but Hazel knew the questions would come again, and when they did, she promised herself she'd be ready with honesty and without bitterness. One chilly afternoon in late November, Nicholas invited both Hazel and Sophie to a children's theater production in the city. Hazel agreed, though her stomach turned with uncertainty. It would be the first time they appeared together in public, not just as two people sharing a daughter, but as something more complex, more vulnerable. Nicholas booked a private booth to avoid unwanted attention, a gesture Hazel silently appreciated. Throughout the performance, Sophie sat between them, laughing loudly, reaching for both of their hands. Hazel watched her daughter's joy and realized that the picture-perfect family she had once dreamed of didn't have to look like the ones in magazines. It could look like this, fractured, mending, real. Afterward they went to a quiet diner, the kind with warm lighting and worn booths that softened even the hardest conversations. Sophie fell asleep in the booth beside Hazel, her head on her mother's lap, clutching a paper crown from the theater. Nicholas sat across from them, his coffee going cold. For a long time neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice low and unsure, he said, "I've been thinking about her future, about yours, about how to be more than just a visitor." Hazel tensed. She had known this moment would come. "Are you asking to move here?" she asked quietly, her fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from Sophie's face. "Not yet," Nicholas replied, "but I've started looking at properties nearby, offices too. I want to make the right choice, but I also want you to know I'm serious. I'm not walking away this time." Hazel looked up at him. His face wasn't pleading, it was open. He wasn't offering a perfect solution, he was simply offering presence. She thought back to the version of him from 5 years ago, polished, proud, calculating. This man was different. He was softer around the edges, no longer concerned with being untouchable. He had lost things, learned things, and somehow become someone who could sit across from her and speak like this, without blame or pressure. Still, part of her held back. She told him honestly, "I don't know if I can forgive everything, Nicholas. You hurt me in a way I never thought I'd recover from." He nodded slowly, taking in the weight of her words without flinching. "I don't expect forgiveness overnight, or ever. But I hope you'll let me show you what I should have been from the start, for you, and for her." Outside, the snow had begun to fall in soft flakes, brushing against the windows in a quiet hush. Hazel looked down at Sophie, still asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling in rhythm with dreams Hazel couldn't enter. She looked back at Nicholas and saw a future she hadn't dared to imagine for years. Not perfect, not easy, but maybe, just maybe, worth trying for. So, she said nothing, only nodded once, a small gesture that spoke louder than any speech. And that night, as they carried their daughter together through the snow and into the car, something inside Hazel shifted. Not all forgiveness comes in words. Sometimes it begins in the simple act of letting someone stay. Spring arrived like a long-held breath finally released. The town, once cloaked in winter gray, came alive with color, and with it came a new sense of rhythm in Hazel's life, one that now included Nicholas. It hadn't happened all at once, and it hadn't come without its challenges. There were awkward moments and quiet missteps, like when he brought Sophie a gift that was too expensive, or when he tried to talk about old times and Hazel had to remind him that nostalgia wasn't healing. But he listened. He adjusted. Slowly his presence shifted from guest to familiar. He rented a small house on the edge of town, not too close to feel invasive, but near enough to be part of their days. He didn't barge into their world. He waited at the edges, learning how to fit into the life Hazel had built. Sophie thrived. Her world expanded with Nicholas in it. They shared the same curious eyes and stubborn chin, and it became more obvious with each passing week that she saw something in him Hazel had tried for years to suppress, a sense of belonging. Hazel had guarded her daughter fiercely, but seeing them together building birdhouses in the backyard, reading bedtime stories, laughing at the same corny jokes, softened her in ways she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about forgiving the past anymore. It was about recognizing the future unfolding in front of her and understanding that she didn't have to face it alone. Hazel was cautious with herself, though. Her heart, once shattered, had been rebuilt carefully, brick by brick, and she wasn't willing to risk it lightly. Nicholas never pushed her. Instead, he let his actions speak. School pickups when she had to work late, making soup when she was sick, helping her mother who had recently re-entered her life with doctor visits and groceries. He didn't try to buy her love or demand it. He simply stayed, and that, more than any grand gesture, began to shift her fear into trust. One evening in early May, they hosted a small picnic in the park where they had first reunited. It wasn't anything elaborate, just sandwiches, lemonade, and a few blankets beneath a blooming tree. Sophie ran around chasing bubbles, while Hazel and Nicholas sat side by side, not touching but close. They talked about everything and nothing: books, childhood, the weather, the strange comfort of quiet routines. Then, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold, Nicholas pulled something from his coat pocket. It wasn't a ring. It was a small handmade wooden box, the kind that opened with a gentle click. Inside was a pendant, a simple silver heart with 3 stars carved into it. One for Hazel, one for Sophie, one for the life they were building. He didn't ask her to marry him. He didn't offer a proposal or a promise. Instead, he said, "You don't have to give me an answer. I just want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. Whether we end up together or not, I will always be here for her and for you, if you'll let me." Hazel stared at the pendant, her throat tightening with emotion she hadn't expected. It wasn't grand, it wasn't public, but it was sincere in a way nothing else had ever been. She closed the box slowly and whispered, "You already are here." Then she reached out, for the first time in years, and took his hand. It was the beginning of something new, not a restart of the past, but the foundation of something they had never given themselves the chance to build before. Not built on illusion or fantasy, but on survival, effort, love, and forgiveness. Months later, Sophie would proudly show her friends the silver pendant around her mother's neck. She would tell them, without understanding the full weight of her words, that it meant their family had found its way back together. And for Hazel, that was enough. The story didn't need to be perfect, it just needed to be theirs. The ending of this story feels earned not because it wraps everything in a perfect bow, but because it allows space for growth, healing, and real emotional truth. Hazel didn't forgive easily, and she shouldn't have. Her journey was never about falling back into old patterns, but about building something stronger from the ruins of betrayal. Nicholas, for his part, didn't demand redemption. He chose to show up and earn it through patience, humility, and genuine presence. What I appreciate most is that the story didn't rush to a fairy tale wedding or sudden declarations of love. Instead, it honored the slow, sometimes painful rebuilding of trust. Sophie's happiness wasn't just a goal, it became the bridge that reconnected two people who had once lost everything. And that moment in the park when Nicholas gave Hazel a symbol of their new beginning rather than a ring, was far more meaningful than any grand romantic gesture could have been. It's a story about second chances, but only when they're deserved, and in that, it offers not just a satisfying conclusion, but a hopeful one grounded in reality.
Daniel Winslow had never believed in fate. His life was built on strategy, power, and control. Nothing happened by accident. But as he knelt in a hospital hallway, staring into the tear-filled blue eyes of a little boy who clung to his hand, he felt his world tilt. The boy had called him Daddy. And the moment Daniel looked up and saw the familiar face of the woman rushing toward them, panic in her eyes, he knew. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was the past coming back to claim him. Daniel Winslow had never been comfortable in hospitals. The bright white lights, the sterile smell of disinfectant, the constant hum of machines, it all felt suffocating. He thrived in high-rise offices, in the middle of negotiations where every word carried weight, where he dictated the terms and controlled the outcome. Here, in these cold, narrow hallways, there was no control. There was only waiting, uncertainty, and the ever-present reminder of human vulnerability. He wasn't here by choice. One of his company's most important investors had recently undergone surgery, and as a sign of respect, Daniel had made a brief visit. It was a calculated move, a small effort to maintain good relationships. He had done what was expected, spent the required amount of time nodding politely and exchanging pleasantries, and now he was ready to leave. As he walked toward the exit, his mind was already shifting back to work. His assistant had scheduled a conference call in 30 minutes. He had emails to review, reports to analyze, a deal waiting for his approval. He had no time for distractions. Then he heard it. A soft, hiccuping sob. It wasn't loud, barely noticeable over the steady beeping of heart monitors and the distant murmur of voices. But something about it made him pause. He wasn't the kind of man who paid attention to strangers, who stopped to investigate things that weren't his concern. And yet, against his better judgment, he turned his head. Sitting alone on a bench near the pediatric ward was a small boy. He couldn't have been older than 4, his blonde hair slightly tousled, his tiny hands wiping at his tear-streaked cheeks. His blue eyes, too big for his face, were filled with distress as he looked around helplessly, as if searching for someone who wasn't there. Daniel frowned. There were doctors and nurses moving about, but no one seemed to notice the child. He glanced around, expecting to see a frantic parent hurrying back to claim him. But no one came. Something twisted in his chest. He had never been particularly good with children. He didn't dislike them, he just didn't know what to do around them. But something about the boy's expression, so lost, so afraid, made it impossible to walk away. Taking a breath, Daniel approached cautiously, stopping a few feet away. "Hey, buddy," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Are you okay?" The boy sniffled, rubbing at his nose with the back of his hand. His lip trembled as he looked up, as if debating whether he should answer. I lost my mommy," the boy finally whispered, his voice barely audible. Daniel exhaled slowly. He should call for a nurse. He should find someone more suited to handle this situation. But the boy was looking at him now, his blue eyes wide, searching his face as if he expected Daniel to fix everything. Kneeling down, Daniel softened his tone. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated, then mumbled, "Olivier." Daniel felt something shift in his chest. He didn't know why, but the name sent a strange ripple through him. "Well, Olivier," he said, keeping his voice steady, "how about we find your mom together?" The boy sniffled again and nodded. Without hesitation, he reached out and grabbed Daniel's hand. Daniel barely had time to process it before Olivier squeezed his fingers, holding on tightly. His small hand was warm, trusting, as if Daniel was someone safe. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't let go. He stood up, scanning the hallway, looking for any sign of someone searching for the boy. A doctor walked past, glancing at them briefly before continuing on. Then, before Daniel could take a step, a voice rang out from around the corner. Olivier. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hall. Daniel turned his head. And everything inside him froze. A woman rushed toward them, her dark brown hair pulled back, her blue eyes filled with panic. She was wearing a nurse's uniform, her hospital badge swinging slightly as she moved. The moment their eyes met, her expression changed. Shock. Recognition. Disbelief. Daniel felt his entire body tense as his mind scrambled to catch up. He knew her. It had been 5 years since he had last seen Sarah Morgan. 5 years since they had spent one unforgettable night together. And now, standing before him, breathless with worry, was the woman who had disappeared from his life without a trace. And in his hand, still clinging to him as if he belonged there, was the little boy who looked exactly like him. Sarah Morgan came to an abrupt stop, her breath catching in her throat as she locked eyes with Daniel. Her heart pounded, her mind racing to process what was happening. She had imagined this moment before, countless times. What she would say if she ever ran into him again. How she would explain the decision she had made. But she had never expected it to happen like this. Her gaze dropped to Olivier, who was still holding Daniel's hand. His small fingers were wrapped tightly around the much larger ones, as if he had already decided that Daniel was someone safe. The sight of them together made her stomach twist. Daniel finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual, but no less intense. Sarah. Her throat felt tight. Daniel. He glanced down at Olivier, then back at her. His expression was unreadable, but his body was tense, his jaw clenched as if he were holding back 100 questions. Sarah forced herself to take a step forward, reaching out for her son. Olivier, sweetheart, are you okay? Olivier turned his big blue eyes up to her and nodded. I couldn't find you. She brushed his blonde hair back gently, trying to steady herself. I was looking for you too, baby. You scared me. Daniel's voice cut through the moment, sharp but controlled. He was sitting alone in the hallway. Crying. Sarah exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of his words. I had to step away for a second to speak with a doctor. I told him to wait right outside the office, but when I came back, he was gone. Daniel studied her for a long moment, then looked down at Olivier again. His gaze softened just slightly. He was scared. Sarah swallowed hard, guilt washing over her. I know. There was silence. The kind that felt too heavy, too charged with things left unsaid. Then Daniel straightened, his eyes locked onto hers. He's mine, isn't he? Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. She knew this moment would come. She had known it from the second she saw the way Daniel looked at Olivier, the way recognition flickered in his expression. But hearing the words out loud made everything real. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, but there was no use in lying. She had kept this secret for too long already. Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel inhaled sharply, his eyes darkening with something she couldn't quite decipher. Shock. Anger. Something else. He turned away for a moment, running a hand through his blonde hair. And you didn't think to tell me? Sarah's grip on Olivier tightened instinctively. It's not that simple, Daniel. His head snapped back toward her. It's exactly that simple. You should have told me. Sarah knew he was right. She had spent years justifying her decision, convincing herself that she had done what was best. But standing here now, looking into the eyes of the man she had once cared about, she could see the hurt behind his frustration. She forced herself to keep her voice steady. I tried. Daniel let out a humorless laugh. Really? Because I don't remember getting a call, a letter, anything. I found out I was pregnant after you had already moved on to another city, she said. I didn't know how to reach you. And when I finally did, I convinced myself that it was better this way. His brows furrowed. Better for who? Sarah flinched at the accusation in his tone. I thought you wouldn't want this, she admitted, her voice softer now. You were so focused on your career. You never talked about wanting a family. You had your whole life planned out, and I didn't think a baby fit into that plan. Daniel's jaw tightened. You didn't give me the chance to decide. Sarah looked away. I know. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Olivier yawned, rubbing at his eyes sleepily, oblivious to the storm brewing between the two adults. Sarah took a steadying breath and forced herself to focus. This wasn't about her and Daniel. It was about their son. She looked up at him again, her expression guarded. I know this is a lot. I didn't plan for you to find out like this. But now that you know, what are you going to do? Daniel didn't answer right away. He just stood there, staring at Olivier, as if he were seeing the last 5 years of his life flash before his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but there was no hesitation. I'm not walking away. Daniel had never been the kind of man who let emotions dictate his actions. He built his success on logic, control, and calculated decisions. But standing here, staring at the child he never knew existed, his mind was anything but clear. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath felt shallow, and for the first time in years, he didn't know what to do. Olivier was his son. The truth was undeniable. It was written all over the boy's face, the blonde hair, the striking blue eyes, the shape of his jaw. He looked so much like Daniel that it was a miracle no one had told him sooner. But no one had. Sarah hadn't. Daniel forced himself to breathe, to push down the anger rising in his chest. Getting angry wouldn't change the past. It wouldn't give him back the years he had lost. He needed to focus on the present, on what came next. Sarah shifted beside him, holding Olivier close as if she were afraid Daniel might take him away. He didn't miss the guarded look in her eyes, the way she braced herself as if she was preparing for a fight. He wasn't sure what she expected him to do. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. I want to know him. Sarah exhaled slowly, as if she had been holding her breath. Daniel, this isn't something you can just decide overnight. He met her gaze, unflinching. I didn't have a choice before. I do now. Sarah hesitated, glancing down at Olivier, who was now resting his head against her shoulder, his small fingers curled into her uniform. His eyes were drooping, exhaustion finally catching up to him. The weight of the moment was lost on him, but it was pressing down on both of them. I need to put him down for a nap, she said quietly. We can talk after. Daniel nodded, following her as she led them down the hall. He wasn't sure why he followed. Maybe he just wasn't ready to walk away, not yet. Maybe he was afraid that if he let them out of his sight, the reality of this moment would slip away, and he would wake up to find out it wasn't real. Sarah pushed open the door to a small pediatric recovery room, gently lowering Olivier onto the bed. He murmured something sleepily, reaching for the stuffed animal at his side before settling into the pillow. She ran her fingers through his hair, whispering softly to him until his breathing slowed, and his tiny body relaxed into sleep. Daniel stood near the doorway, watching. He had missed so much. He had missed Olivier's first steps, his first words, the sound of his laughter. He had missed birthdays, bedtime stories, scraped knees, and whispered goodnights. And now, watching Sarah care for their son with practiced ease, he felt the loss settle into his chest like a weight too heavy to bear. When she finally turned back to him, her expression was unreadable. She gestured for him to step outside, quietly pulling the door closed behind them. They stood in the hallway, the space between them thick with unspoken words. Sarah crossed her arms, her posture defensive. What exactly do you want, Daniel? He didn't hesitate. I want to be in his life. She let out a quiet, humorless laugh. And what does that mean to you? Weekly visits? Sending a check every month? What? His jaw tightened. I don't know yet. But I'm not going to disappear. Sarah studied him, searching for something in his expression. He doesn't know about you. Not really. I never told him you left or that you didn't want him. I told him his dad was far away, and that was it. Daniel clenched his fists at his sides. I didn't leave, Sarah. You never gave me the chance to stay. She flinched, guilt flashing across her face. I know. Her voice was quieter now. I thought I was doing what was best for him. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. And now? Sarah hesitated. Now, I don't know. He's never had a father. I don't know how to explain this to him, how to make him understand that you weren't there because you didn't know. Daniel's chest tightened. Then let's figure it out together. She looked up at him, surprise flickering across her face. For the first time since she had run into him, she didn't look like she was bracing for the worst. And for the first time in his life, Daniel wasn't thinking about work, about profits, about the future he had meticulously built for himself. For the first time, he was thinking about them. Sarah didn't respond right away. She stood there, arms crossed, staring at him as if trying to decide whether or not to believe him. Daniel didn't blame her. He wasn't sure she should believe him. He had never been a father before. He didn't know what it meant to have a child rely on him, to have someone look up to him the way Olivier already had in the short time they had spent together. But he knew one thing for certain, he wasn't going to walk away from his son. Sarah finally let out a slow breath, her posture relaxing slightly. Okay, she said, though there was still hesitation in her voice. Let's figure it out. Daniel nodded, relieved that she wasn't shutting him out completely. But there was still so much to address, so many unanswered questions hanging between them. He glanced at the closed door to Olivier's room, lowering his voice slightly. What does he know about me? Sarah shifted uncomfortably, as if she had been dreading that question. Not much, she admitted. I told him his dad was far away. That was all he ever asked. Daniel frowned, the weight of her words sinking in. So he never asked why I wasn't around? Sarah hesitated before shaking her head. Not really. He's still young. He doesn't question things the way older kids do. He just accepted it. Daniel swallowed hard. The idea that his own son had never wondered about him, never asked for him, should have been a relief. But instead, it left a hollow ache in his chest. He had been absent for his entire life, and Olivier hadn't even noticed. Sarah must have sensed what he was thinking because her voice softened. It's not because he didn't want to know you, Daniel. He just didn't have a reason to think you'd ever be there. Daniel exhaled slowly, nodding. And now? She looked at him, something unreadable in her expression. Now you're here. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything left unsaid. Finally, Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to just introduce you into his life without confusing him. Daniel squared his shoulders. Then let's take it slow. I don't want to rush him. I just want to be around. Sarah studied him carefully, searching his face for any sign of hesitation. She had spent years raising Olivier alone, making every decision for him, protecting him from anything that might hurt him. Letting Daniel in, trusting that he meant what he said, was a risk. After a moment, she nodded. All right. But we do this my way. On my terms. Daniel lifted an eyebrow. And what exactly does that mean? It means no sudden changes, she said firmly. No big promises you might not be able to keep. No overwhelming him with something he doesn't understand yet. Daniel nodded, though the idea of slow progress made his stomach tighten. He had already lost so much time. But he had no choice. This wasn't a business deal. He couldn't negotiate his way into being a father. "What's the first step?" he asked. Sarah sighed. "Spend time with him. Let him get used to you. But don't push it. He has to come to you on his own." Daniel exhaled. That was something he could do. At that moment, the door to Olivier's room creaked open, and the little boy peeked out, rubbing his sleepy eyes. His blonde hair was a mess, and his voice was groggy when he spoke. "Mommy?" Sarah turned immediately, crouching down to his level. "I'm right here, sweetheart." Olivier's gaze shifted, landing on Daniel. For a second, there was nothing but quiet curiosity in his expression. Then, to Daniel's surprise, he took a few hesitant steps forward and reached for his hand. Daniel froze, barely breathing as Olivier's small fingers wrapped around his. Sarah watched silently, her lips parting slightly in surprise. Olivier looked up at him with the same trusting blue eyes that had stopped Daniel in his tracks the first time he saw him. "Are you staying?" Daniel felt his throat tighten, the weight of the question hitting him harder than he expected. He tightened his grip just slightly, looking down at his son, and spoke with more certainty than he had ever felt in his life. "Yes. I'm staying." Daniel had never thought about what it meant to be needed by someone. In business, people relied on him for leadership, for decisions, for the weight of his name behind deals that shaped industries. But that wasn't the same as this. This was something entirely different. This was a 4-year-old boy standing in front of him, waiting for a promise, trusting without hesitation. And for the first time in his life, Daniel felt the crushing responsibility of what that trust meant. Olivier's hand was still wrapped around his, small and warm, and Daniel found himself gripping back instinctively. He wasn't sure what the boy expected from him, wasn't sure what he was supposed to say next. But when he looked down, Olivier just smiled, as if Daniel's presence alone was enough. That realization made something shift deep in his chest. Sarah watched the exchange carefully, her expression unreadable. He knew she was still wary, still unsure if he was capable of being in Olivier's life. He didn't blame her. He wasn't sure of it himself. But he wasn't going to fail before he even tried. Sarah straightened, her voice soft but firm. "He just woke up. He'll be hungry soon." Daniel hesitated. He wasn't sure if that was an invitation or just an observation, but he decided to take it as the first. "Can I take you both to lunch?" Sarah's lips pressed together in a way that made him think she was about to say no, but before she could, Olivier tugged at Daniel's hand. "Can we get pancakes?" Daniel glanced down, caught off guard. "Pancakes?" Olivier nodded eagerly, his blue eyes lighting up. "Mommy lets me have pancakes sometimes for lunch." Daniel smirked slightly before looking back at Sarah. "I'll take that as a yes." She sighed, clearly torn, but after a moment, she nodded. "Fine. But somewhere quiet. I don't want him overwhelmed." Daniel nodded in agreement. He wasn't ready to parade around in public with a son he had just learned about, and he could tell Sarah wanted to keep things as normal for Olivier as possible. They left the hospital together, Sarah carrying a small backpack for Olivier, and Daniel following closely behind. He still couldn't quite wrap his head around the fact that this was real. It felt strange, walking beside them, as if they were a family when they barely knew how to function as one. They found a small cafe near the hospital, tucked away on a quiet street. It was cozy, with large windows letting in soft light, and a few families scattered throughout. Sarah led Olivier to a booth, sitting beside him, while Daniel took the seat across from them. A waitress approached, giving them a friendly smile. "What can I get for you all today?" Olivier perked up immediately. "Pancakes, please." The waitress chuckled. Good choice, kiddo. And for you too. Sarah glanced at Daniel, then back at the menu. I'll have the same. Daniel had never ordered pancakes in his life, but something about the way Olivier grinned made him say, "Make it 3." Olivier beamed, kicking his feet under the table. Sarah shook her head with a quiet laugh. I never thought I'd see the day Daniel Winslow willingly ordered pancakes. Daniel leaned back slightly, smirking. I guess today is full of surprises. Sarah's expression softened slightly, but there was still a distance between them, a hesitation she wasn't ready to let go of yet. He didn't blame her. Olivier started talking, completely at ease, rambling about his favorite cartoons and how he liked to build towers out of blocks. He spoke to Daniel as if they had known each other forever, as if he hadn't spent his entire life without a father. The innocence of it all hit Daniel harder than he expected. At one point, Olivier reached for the crayons the cafe had provided, pulling the small activity sheet closer. Daddy, color with me. Daniel froze. The word hit him like a freight train. It had come so easily, so naturally, as if Olivier had always known to call him that. Daniel swallowed hard, trying to push past the sudden tightness in his chest. He glanced at Sarah, expecting her to correct him, to remind Olivier that this was new, that this man was still a stranger in some ways. But she didn't say anything. She just watched, waiting to see what Daniel would do. Daniel picked up a blue crayon, his fingers curling around it tightly as he exhaled. All right, what are we coloring? Olivier grinned, pushing the paper toward him. Daniel forced himself to relax, focusing on the simple lines in front of him. He wasn't good at this. He didn't know how to be a father, how to fit into a world that had already existed without him. But Olivier didn't seem to care. He just wanted Daniel there. And for the first time, Daniel realized he wanted to be there too. The cafe was warm, filled with the low hum of conversations and the occasional clatter of plates. Daniel sat across from Olivier and Sarah, watching as the boy carefully colored inside the lines of his activity sheet. It was such a simple thing, something normal, something millions of parents did with their children every day. And yet, for him, it felt monumental. He had spent his entire life chasing things he could measure, success, power, wealth. But none of it had ever made him feel the way he felt right now, sitting here with a 4-year-old boy who had called him daddy without hesitation. Sarah was quiet as she watched them. She hadn't said anything about it, hadn't corrected Olivier or tried to explain anything away. Daniel wasn't sure if that was a sign of trust or if she was waiting to see if he would run. He couldn't blame her for that. He had never been a man who stayed in one place for too long. But things were different now. The waitress returned with their food, placing 3 plates of pancakes in front of them. Olivier's eyes lit up as he grabbed his fork, stabbing into the fluffy stack with excitement. He drizzled way too much syrup over them, making a mess as he tried to cut a piece on his own. Sarah reached over to help him, steadying his plate before it could tip. Daniel watched the small interaction and felt the weight of how much he had missed. Sarah had been doing this alone for years, every meal, every scraped knee, every bedtime story. She had been both mother and father to Olivier, carrying the responsibility of raising him without any help. And now, here Daniel was, stepping into the middle of something that had existed just fine without him. Olivier chewed happily before looking up at Daniel. You have to put butter on yours, Daddy. It makes it taste better. Daniel hesitated at the word again, but this time, it didn't hit quite as hard. He picked up the small butter packet beside his plate and opened it. Like this? Olivier nodded eagerly. Yeah. And then lots of syrup. Daniel did as he was told, spreading the butter and adding more syrup than he normally would. When he took a bite, Olivier grinned. Isn't it the best? Daniel swallowed, nodding. It's pretty good. Olivier beamed as if he had just won some great victory. Sarah smiled slightly, shaking her head. He takes his pancakes very seriously. Daniel smirked. I can see that. The conversation was easy after that. Olivier talked about everything, his favorite bedtime stories, his favorite color, how he was trying to learn how to tie his shoes but it was really hard. He spoke to Daniel as if they had always known each other, as if the past 4 years of absence had never happened. The ease with which Olivier accepted him made Daniel's chest ache. Sarah was more reserved. She spoke when needed, answered questions, but she was still guarded. Daniel could tell she was watching him carefully, making sure he didn't make promises he couldn't keep. When the meal was over, the waitress brought the check, but before Daniel could reach for it, Sarah took it first. He raised an eyebrow. You don't have to do that. Sarah glanced at him. I can pay for my own food, Daniel. He studied her for a moment, understanding what she meant. She wasn't going to let him walk in and suddenly start taking over. She wasn't going to make it easy for him to claim a place in their lives just because he had money. This wasn't about what he could provide financially. It was about what he was willing to be. Daniel let his hand fall back onto the table. All right, he said simply. Sarah paid the bill, and they gathered their things to leave. Olivier reached for Daniel's hand as they walked outside, and Daniel took it without hesitation. It felt natural now. Sarah led them back toward the hospital, where she had left her car. Olivier was talking about something excitedly, but Daniel wasn't listening. His focus was on Sarah, on the tension in her shoulders, on the way she still seemed unsure of him. When they reached the parking lot, she turned to him, her expression unreadable. This was good, she said. But this doesn't change everything overnight. Daniel nodded. I know. She hesitated, then sighed. I don't know what this is supposed to look like. I don't know how to do this. Daniel met her gaze. Then let's figure it out together. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then finally nodded. Okay. Olivier yawned, rubbing at his eyes. Sarah opened the back door of the car, helping him climb into his car seat. He looked up at Daniel sleepily. Are you gonna see me tomorrow? Daniel didn't hesitate this time. Yeah, buddy. I'll see you tomorrow. Olivier smiled, satisfied with that answer, before resting his head against the seat. Sarah glanced at Daniel once more before getting into the driver's seat. As she pulled away, Daniel stood there, watching them go, realizing that for the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about work, about power, about anything that had once seemed so important. For the first time, he was thinking about what really mattered. And he wasn't going to let it slip away. Daniel arrived at the hospital the next morning earlier than expected. He wasn't sure what time Sarah would bring Olivier in, but he didn't want to take any chances. He had told his son he would see him today, and he wasn't about to break that promise. He had spent the morning ignoring emails, letting calls go to voicemail, and canceling meetings he would have never skipped before. Work had ruled his life for as long as he could remember, but for the first time, it wasn't his priority. He paced near the front entrance, glancing at his watch, feeling a strange kind of nervous energy that he wasn't used to. He had given presentations in front of thousands, negotiated billion-dollar deals, and built an empire from the ground up, yet standing here waiting for a 4-year-old boy made him feel like he was about to step into something far more terrifying than anything he had faced before. When Sarah's car finally pulled up, he exhaled, forcing himself to stay composed. She stepped out first, glancing at him briefly before opening the back door to help Olivier out of his car seat. The little boy yawned, rubbing his eyes before his gaze landed on Daniel. His tired expression instantly brightened. Daddy! Olivier practically launched himself out of the car, running straight toward Daniel with open arms. Daniel barely had time to react before Olivier collided into him, wrapping his small arms around his legs. The impact sent a shockwave through him, something deep and unshakable. He had spent the last 24 hours thinking about how much he had missed, about how much time he had lost. But Olivier didn't seem to care. He wasn't thinking about the years without his father. He was thinking about right now, about this moment, and that realization nearly knocked the air out of Daniel's lungs. He crouched down, resting a hand on Olivier's back. "Hey, buddy. You sleep okay?" Olivier nodded, still holding on to him. "I had a dream about dolphins." Daniel chuckled. "Yeah. What were they doing?" "They were playing. And jumping really high out of the water." Olivier finally pulled back, grinning up at him. "Have you ever seen a real dolphin?" Daniel thought for a moment. "I have. A long time ago." Olivier's eyes widened. "Did they splash you?" Daniel smirked. "A little." Olivier giggled. "If we ever see dolphins together, I bet they'll splash you a lot." Daniel swallowed hard. The way Olivier said "we" so easily, as if there had never been a time without him, sent an unfamiliar warmth through him. He glanced up at Sarah, who was standing beside the car, watching them with a cautious but unreadable expression. "Where are you two headed?" Daniel asked, standing up. Sarah hesitated. "We were just going to run a few errands before I drop him off with my sister for a couple of hours." Daniel nodded, thinking. "Mind if I tag along?" Sarah studied him carefully, as if trying to figure out if he was serious. "You want to come grocery shopping with us?" Daniel shrugged. "Why not?" Olivier's face lit up. "Yes. Daddy, can we get the dinosaur cereal?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Dinosaur cereal?" Olivier nodded enthusiastically. "It has marshmallows shaped like T-Rexes." Daniel smirked before looking at Sarah. "Is that allowed?" Sarah sighed, but there was a small smile on her lips. "If you want to deal with a sugar rush later, be my guest." Daniel grinned. "Sounds like a challenge." Sarah shook her head, motioning for Olivier to get back into the car. "Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you." Daniel climbed into the passenger seat, feeling strangely comfortable in a situation that should have felt foreign to him. He had never done this before, never just spent a day doing normal things with family. Yet, as Sarah drove and Olivier talked excitedly from the back seat, he felt more at ease than he had in years. When they arrived at the store, Olivier immediately grabbed Daniel's hand, pulling him inside as if this were the most exciting adventure of his life. They weaved through aisles, Olivier pointing out things he wanted, Sarah trying to balance letting him have treats while still buying what they actually needed. At one point, Olivier tugged on Daniel's sleeve. "Can I ride in the cart?" Daniel looked at Sarah for approval. She sighed, shaking her head with a small smile. "If you lift him in, he's your responsibility if he starts throwing things." Daniel smirked. "Deal." He lifted Olivier into the cart, settling him into the front seat. The boy immediately grabbed the shopping list from Sarah's hands and started pretending to read it. "We need cookies, and candy, and pizza, and..." Sarah snatched the list back with a laugh. "Nice try." Olivier giggled, leaning back as Daniel pushed the cart down the aisle. He glanced at Sarah, watching the way she effortlessly managed everything, the way she kept Olivier entertained while also making sure she got everything done. He had always known she was strong, but now he was starting to see just how much she had carried on her own. When they reached the cereal aisle, Olivier gasped dramatically. "Dinosaur cereal." Daniel grabbed a box, dropping it into the cart. Olivier clapped his hands excitedly. "Daddy, you're the best." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, something unfamiliar and overwhelming. He had spent years trying to be the best in business, the best in negotiations, the best in wealth. But hearing those words from his son, over something as simple as a box of cereal, meant more than any deal he had ever made. Sarah watched them carefully, her expression softer now. As they headed toward the checkout line, Daniel realized something. This was what he had been missing. This was what really mattered. And he wasn't going to let it slip away. The drive back from the store was filled with Olivier's excited chatter. He talked about the dinosaur cereal as if it were the greatest discovery of his life, swinging his legs in the car's seat while explaining, in great detail, how the marshmallows made the milk turn different colors. Daniel listened, nodding at all the right moments, while Sarah occasionally glanced at them through the rearview mirror. It still didn't feel real. The idea that he had a son, that this little boy who spoke to him so easily, who looked at him with so much trust, had been in the world for 4 years without him knowing, it was still sinking in. But the weight of it no longer felt suffocating. It felt like something else entirely. Something grounding. When they pulled up to Sarah's house, Daniel expected her to say something, to tell him this was enough for one day. But she simply unbuckled Olivier from his car seat and led the way inside, not stopping him from following. It was a small house, cozy but well kept, filled with signs of the life Sarah had built. Toys were scattered in one corner of the living room, drawings taped to the fridge. There were no traces of him here. No photos. No reminders. Olivier immediately ran to the couch, tearing open the box of dinosaur cereal. He shoved a handful into his mouth before looking up at Daniel. "Do you want some?" Daniel chuckled. "Sure." Olivier grinned and held out his tiny hand, cereal spilling onto the couch. Daniel took a few pieces, popping them into his mouth, ignoring the way Sarah rolled her eyes at both of them. After a moment, she sighed and turned to Daniel. "Do you want some coffee?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. It wasn't exactly an invitation, but it wasn't a dismissal either. "Yeah. That'd be great." She disappeared into the kitchen while Daniel sat down on the couch beside Olivier. The boy immediately scooted closer, his small body pressing against Daniel's side as he continued munching on cereal. "Mommy says I start school soon," Olivier said between bites. Daniel looked down at him. "Are you excited?" Olivier shrugged. "A little. Mommy says I'll make lots of friends. But what if they don't like dinosaurs?" Daniel smirked. "Then they don't know what they're missing." Olivier grinned, leaning against him. Sarah returned a few minutes later, handing Daniel a cup of coffee before sitting down across from them. She watched them in silence, her fingers wrapped around her own mug. "I don't know what this is supposed to look like," she admitted after a moment. "I don't know how to just let you be in his life." Daniel nodded, setting his coffee down on the table. "I don't either. But I know I want to be here. And I know I want to be his father." Sarah exhaled slowly, as if she had been holding in those words, waiting to see if they were true. "Olivier is all I've had for the past 4 years. I made every decision with him in mind. I protected him. I didn't tell you about him, and I know that wasn't fair. But I need you to understand that I won't let anyone hurt him. Not even you." Daniel met her gaze, understanding exactly what she meant. "I won't leave." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Olivier yawned, curling up against Daniel's side, his little body warm and trusting. Sarah's expression softened as she watched them, something shifting in her eyes. Daniel wasn't sure what the future looked like, but he knew one thing for certain: he had been given a second chance. A chance to be a father, a chance to build something real. And he wasn't going to waste it. He wrapped an arm around Olivier, holding him close as the boy drifted off to sleep. For the first time in his life, Daniel Winslow wasn't thinking about business, power, or success. For the first time, he was exactly where he was meant to be. This story is about redemption, second chances, and the realization that true success isn't measured by wealth or power, but by the connections we build with the people who matter most. Daniel Winslow starts as a man who believes he has complete control over his life, only to be confronted with the shocking truth that he has a son he never knew about. At first, he reacts as any businessman would, trying to find a solution, a way to fix what was broken. But as the story unfolds, he realizes that being a father isn't something that can be negotiated or planned. It's about showing up, about being present, about choosing love over ambition. Sarah is the heart of the story in many ways. She carries the weight of her decisions, knowing that she kept Olivier a secret but also believing she did what was best at the time. Her hesitation to let Daniel in isn't just about protecting her son, it's about protecting herself from the possibility that he might walk away again. Her journey is just as important as Daniel's because she has to learn to trust that he's truly here to stay. Olivier, with his innocence and unconditional love, is the catalyst for change. He doesn't see complications, betrayals, or lost time. He only sees his father and embraces him without hesitation. That's what makes this story so powerful. It's not about fixing the past. It's about choosing to move forward, to build something new, even if it's uncertain. The ending is satisfying because it doesn't promise perfection. It doesn't tie everything up neatly in a bow. Instead, it offers something more meaningful, hope. Daniel doesn't magically become the perfect father overnight. Sarah doesn't immediately erase years of doubt. But they take a step towards something real, something worth fighting for. And in the end, that's what truly matters.